Welcome to Prose from the Underground, coming to you from my basement in northern Michigan, where I read, write, think, and say things, and sometimes I get to talk to someone. Today I talked to Ben Wetherbee, a former student of mine, back when we were both at Northwestern Michigan College. Ben went on to earn a PhD in rhetoric. He also went on to write rhetorical theory and to get published in some of the most prestigious academic journals of our day. You might ask, what in the heck's a rhetorician doing on Prose from the Underground? Well, a confession, I am a rhetorician. I have a degree in rhetoric, and I've struggled or thought for years about the relationship between rhetorical theory and literary work. In fact, for many years, there still are, two vociferous camps in English departments in America, the literary folks and the rhetoric folks. When I was in graduate school, these people were very much at war, two camps fighting over resources and various other issues related to academic institutions. I believe that war is still being waged, perhaps in quieter ways in different places. Ben is going to come along today and make a really elegant case for a kind of reconciliation, for shared understanding. In fact, I think he'll make a crucial case for those creative writers who've not thought hard and long about rhetorical theory. He makes a really important point. In fact, I appeal to your best wits to listen closely to what Ben has to say. As it turns out, the two camps may share fire, and only those who resist that will get left out in the cold. This is a longer discussion, and I've decided to keep it intact as much as possible because Ben is just a ton of fun to listen to. As you'll see, he's a very high-octane thinker and also careful and elegant in the things that he says. I hope you enjoy. Tell us, Ben, if you would, what does a rhetorician do? What's the mission, the writerly mission of someone who does rhetorical criticism?
It's a tough question because if you ask, 12 different rhetoricians what rhetoric means, you'll get 12 related but slightly different answers. Rhetoric's not unique in that way, but we are especially persnickety in defining what we do. But I think you can sort of pin it down to something like this. We are advancing and theorizing and trying to better understand a certain attitude toward an understanding of language as something that's not just reflective of reality, but active. Language is something that kind of makes the world that we're in, and language does things in the world rather than just reflecting our thoughts or describing what's really there. So that's part one. Language is active, and the other part I would add is that we're thinking about language as something that's radically contingent. So rhetoricians are always looking at how things like persuasion and power and emotional effect happen in context through language and its associated things like visual symbol systems and so forth. So that's the big thing. I would say that in contrast to maybe philosophical attitudes towards language, which try to hammer down abstract universal truths, and maybe in some contrast towards more artistic and literary understandings of language as this sort of art object that one isolates as if it's on a museum wall and admires. We're talking about language as something that's active and present and doing things in the world. Language does, not just is.
I found when I started moving from the world of rhetorical theory to literary work, that the literary folks, the people who are practicing working writers, share this notion that writing does things in the world. Don't look at it, and we're not entirely committed to what something means. I think that's something that a lot of folks do in education. Well, what does a story mean? And the people I know who are writing stories and working on poetry, the word meaning very rarely comes up. Instead, it's what does this story do? What does this character do, etc. When I
Yeah,
was teaching rhetorical theory, I would
seems
say,
like fiction writers talk about craft all the time, which is a
yep.
very, rhetorical term that stems from like this ancient idea of, sorry to be this guy, but like techne or informed theory, what the ancient Greeks called techne, and it was this, um, understanding of how to do things in a knowledgeable way for certain effects that they applied to language and to, like, carpentry as well.
That's
But
right.
yeah, craft, and I think there's a disciplinary divide there between uh fiction writers and poetry writers, creative writing people, and literary critics, at least in a sort of stodgy older tradition. Um, and the former have a lot in common with rhetoric people, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. We're all what I always like to say is the F word for us is function. What is the function of this thing? What does it do in the world? As you say, I
Yeah.
just want to ask one follow-up question. You've done so much great writing, and it's clearly been acclaimed and accepted in prestigious places in the world. Um, Give us just a 1 minute version of what a project, a rhetorical criticism project. You take a particular aspect, thing, text, or perhaps a figure, and do something with that.
Yeah. So usually we've got some theoretical idea, um, and we've got some example. And I'll give you the example of the paper I wrote most recently with my friend and colleague, Genevieve Gordon, who's now a master's student at Penn State. Brilliant, brilliant co-author. But we were looking at the COVID era face mask and sort of what that thing is signifying rhetorically, not just as a medical precaution, medical artifact, but as a social symbol. And how has it been marked for different ideological groups to say different things? Um, and we noticed that the way the face mask is being used in political arguments, especially, just sort of circumvents all medical questions about its efficacy. It's a symbol of totalitarianism. It's a symbol of the nanny state. It's a symbol of the government trying to control you. And we noticed that this mapped onto this ancient Greek idea called stasis theory, where you have a series of increasingly specific questions. And we noticed that mass discourse was skipping the first question, which is what exists in the world, what's true, and just going straight to the second social question of how do we define this thing. And I don't want to get into the weeds too much there, but we noticed that there's an interesting crossover here that then asks us to reconsider this term in the first place, and in order to better understand this pressing concern in the world. So we were trying to both tweak rhetorical theory to understand how stasis theory is working in a modern context and better understand our own current social medical predicament. That was more
Right.
than a minute. I'm sorry.
Right. And that was published. That was fine. That was published where?
That is forthcoming very soon in the journal Rhetoric Review.
Which is huge. That's very cool. I'm going to ask a fussy writerly question. When you're working on an article like this, that's pretty dense, that you're walking through some really intense rhetorical concepts, what is it that you're trying to do with the writing itself? Of course, you're doing a lot of reading and researching, but when it comes to your text, you're set in front of your word program or whatever it is. What do you fuss over, work on when it comes to the language?
I'll give you two answers. Quick first answer is maybe the one you'd expect, which is I'm still very fussy and persnickety about sentences. I like ironing out as much prepositional fluff and passive verbs and all that jazz. I like trying to write really clean, active, engaging stuff, and trying to resist the creep of academic language or academic prose towards unreadable, dense jargon. So I'm trying. The other perhaps deeper answer is that you alluded to the fact that a lot of what actually goes into the academic writing process is research. We might spend more time reading than we actually writing when we're writing an academic article or putting in the intellectual work towards an academic article. And when you've got that sort of list of sources you could draw from and some quotes you might want to drop in the paper and all that stuff, there's this sort of deep ethical question that settles over me, that that stems from the knowledge that these sources are also coming from people. That's not just a line on a works cited page. That's a person and the work they've put into it. And we are collaboratively engaging in this social writing process, advancing the collective knowledge of rhetorical theory, or any other discipline. They all do this, kinesiology or microbiology or whatever. And I feel a not quite crushing but very significant weight of trying to articulate that intellectual debt as I sort out the structure of the paper, trying to figure out who am I in conversation with, who has meaningfully affected my thought here, and how can I signal that, and then how can I meaningfully signal where other writers' ideas leave off and mine begin, or in the case of the last paper, where ours begin. The ideas Genevieve and I worked through together, and it's something I try to teach too when I'm teaching writing, even in first year classes. A lot of times people are told they have to integrate 5 sources into this paper to get an A, but it kind of puts the cart before the horse. The real first question with research should be this ethical consideration of how we're orienting our ideas among other voices and how to signal that in the writing process, which is very hard, but I think also very rewarding and fascinating.
I'm going to throw one last question at you. You have written and you've had some publications in creative genres. So you've certainly thought about this relationship in some capacity. What do you think is the relationship between literary genres, creative genres, and scholarly work, scholarly prose? Are they friends? Are they enemies? Are they distant cousins, two ships that never pass in the night? What's the relationship there?
That's a great question. Maybe I'll call back the previous answer real quick to begin, which is to say that academic writing and its citation systems and everything kind of makes explicit this pattern of research and intellectual debt, but that stuff is still there tacitly in the background when you're writing creatively too, right? Yeah. Many gallons of ink have been spilled on the influence of Shakespeare on Joyce, and whatever, pick your literary lineage. Mm-hmm. And anytime I write creatively, I'm thinking about whose toolbox I'm borrowing and whose moves I'm mimicking and so forth, right? So I think that's always there. That's just a part of writing, and just some genres make it explicit, some genres it's implicit. So I think creative and theoretical / polemical / expository rhetorical genres, I think they should be friends, and I think they have a lot in common. Maybe not even distant cousins, like cousins that hang out at the family barbecue once a month. Nice. At least. So I'll be annoying and like academic-y and cite a source here, but I'll get away from that too. We can point back to something like Aristotle's conception of rhetoric and poetics, pragmatic, results-oriented civic discourse rhetoric, and artistic, fine arts language that mimics reality towards our artistic effect, poetics. That's what we call literature now, basically. And we can look back at the sort of evolution of those two concepts through history, and we can look at our present moment and say with some certainty that what we're experiencing now, where these two things are compartmentalized and have disciplinary divisions between them, it's sort of a weird, arbitrary historical curiosity, I think. What Aristotle said, and Aristotle's wrong about a lot of things, and I'm not saying that we have to seek a Greek authority on every topic, but I think he's right about this, is that those two are sort of massively cross-pollinating genres. If you're doing rhetoric, you seek out literary exemplars to fine-tune your language and do things like style really well.
Mhm.
And if you're writing poetics, often your main job is to sort of dramatize the social upheavals of your world and turn social situations into art. And to do that, you have to understand how people persuade themselves and affect each other through language. So you can find wonderful examples of, classical rhetorical speech in Homer.
Sure.
It's a poem. It's not what we would usually think of as a rhetorical genre, but it's embedded in there are many, many, many rhetorical genres. Different, more recent theorist who I know you and I both love, the Russian critic Mikhail Bakhtin, looked at the novel and said that what's fascinating about the novel is that it's this massively multi-voice democratic genre that does what it does by bringing together lots of different little rhetorical genres through speech and writing and the narration of the narrator. And it's this interesting, obviously there are many different ways of doing the novel, but most of them involve this interesting stitching together of different constituent pieces, that is sort of making art out of little rhetorical genres. And when you notice that, it's fascinating, and you say, well, there's no real hard and fast division here. You can't really do literature without understanding something about rhetoric. And if you're doing rhetoric, it certainly behooves you to understand something about literature. And do you have time for one little
Yeah,
example?
I wanted to throw
Okay.
the term heteroglossia. It was the term
Yes.
that was, wrapped around my head for years in graduate studies and thereafter, for this very reason. And it's, I think, one of the reasons why I fell so deeply in love with 100 Years of Solitude, for instance, the
Yeah.
cacophony of that kind of book. The story is just loaded with all of these utterances that are orchestrated in some ways, but they're typically, we might see them as dissonant in some ways, but they come together and they sing in this really
Hmm.
alarming, arresting way. So yeah, a final thought then, Ben.
Yeah. So all right, Bakhtin says that the language or the novel is this intensely democratic genre that pushes back against the authoritarian urge to stifle speech into one correct pattern, and that's why Stalin exiled him to Kazakhstan. So ideas have consequences. I was going to point to, this is one of my favorite examples when approached by a question like this. I was going to point to Darwin's last paragraph in The Origin of Species,
Beautiful. Nice.
which is maybe the most famous piece of science writing ever. I won't read the whole thing because it's lengthy, but I'll read a couple sentences. So this is the end of this pretty massive book, right? Last paragraph. Darwin says, "It is interesting to contemplate an entangled bank clothed with many plants of many kinds, with birds singing in the bushes, with various insects flitting about, and with worms crawling through the damp earth, and to reflect on these elaborately constructed forms so different from each other and dependent on each other in so complex a manner, have it all been produced through laws acting around us." And he says a little bit about those laws, which is basically the thesis of the book. And then at the end of the paragraph, he says, "There is grandeur in this view of life, with its several powers having been originally breathed into a few forms or into one, and that whilst this planet has gone cycling on, according to the fixed law of gravity from so simple a beginning, endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful, have been and are being evolved." Good writing, I think you would agree. um,
Yes.
Now we can look at something like that and say, is that literary? My gut answer is yes. It feels literary to me intuitively, and I think most people would agree. Is it rhetorical? I think it must be, because it is attempting very overtly to persuade a pretty large readership of a certain set of scientific ideas. Is
Sure.
it theoretical and expository? Yes, all the
Yep.
above, right? Because it's couched in this much larger argument that in some places feels like much more traditional science writing with lots of, very fine-grained examples and data and so forth. But what Darwin did here is he recognized the rhetorical situation of his work, which is that he was, making a frankly heretical argument about how species evolve and so forth. And you could say he softened it, but he also made it something sort of transcendental, right? Like, this isn't just a Darwin versus God argument. It's a way of sort of couching the argument in a very positive view of the world that allows for this to be something that expresses grandeur. That's the word that often gets repeated when people are talking about there is grandeur in this view of life. And it sounds very religious, even though it's, pushing back against a lot of very core religious assumptions from that time and from our time. So it's a fascinating paragraph for just illustrating how the literary, the rhetorical, the polemical, the theoretical can all be bound up together in this mushy but very effective ball of language.